You're listening to the Mushroom Revival podcast. Welcome back, Mushroom family. We are about to shroom in for another episode of the Mushroom Revival podcast, another week of geeking out and nerding about mushrooms and fungi. Today, we're covering the mycology, yet again, of wood spalting with the expert, Dr. Sari Robinson.
You got that right. Spalting 2.0. We had a short episode on this a month or so ago, but y'all, I left so much juicy information out. It was only just to let the expert themselves share what they know on this niche, but surprisingly auspicious science.
This episode will give you a unique fungal perspective that you can't get anywhere else. And we think you're going to love it.
I certainly loved it so much that I signed up for Sari and their team's Patreon, which has the coolest perk ever. Once a month, you get a free fungus, a free spalting culture. Guess what just came in the mail 2 days ago? An Elf's Cup blue stain fungus, the best Patreon perk ever. That's like how much you'd pay for a culture anyway. And you get really pretty cultures that make beautiful pigments. So maybe add your name to the list.
But before we dive in, the review of the week. This whole episode is basically Lyra and Dr. Sari Robinson. So let's hear from our wonderful listeners. This week's featured review is from L. Ron Hobdonger. The title is Love This Podcast. Just started to cultivate my own mushrooms, king oyster and lion's mane, and this is a great pod to have on while I watch the mycelium grow. They have such insightful people on, but sometimes I just want to hear what the hosts have to say. Would love to hear some podcasts with just the main peeps. Keep on the awesome podcast. Much love from Dallas. Thanks. We honestly, to answer your question or your request, our first episode ever, we did Myco 101, one of our most listened to podcasts. And listening back from years ago, it's a little cringy. So we're looking to re-record that episode, and that will just be me and Lyra geeking out about Mushrooms 101. Also, we have 11 new products coming out in a little under 2 months, month and a half. And we have a bunch of exciting projects launching, and we will do a whole housekeeping episode in a month or two. Just check in on our life, what exciting things are going on. So that'll be another episode, just us two. But in the meantime, if you want to support the show, if you want to support both of us and the whole team here at Mushroom Revival, you can go to our website at mushroomrevival.com, use the coupon code PODTREAT for a special but unique and surprise discount code.
An ever-changing discount code.
Ever-changing.
I go in there and change.
We won't tell you what it is. You have to plug it in to find out what your discount is going to be, like an Easter egg, to get all your mushroom goodies, to support your energy, focus, immune support, support against occasional stress and fatigue. You name it, mushrooms are there for you.
And now, it is time to get weird with spalting fungi with Dr. Sari Robinson. Sari Robinson, thank you so much for joining me today on the Mushroom Revival podcast.
I'm so excited to be here.
I can't believe I hadn't found out about you earlier. So
I lurk in the shadows. That's the problem, like a fungus. Yep.
Yeah, I feel like that's the nature of spalting too, Mm-hmm. So I watched your documentary and I heard a bit about your story, but I would love for our listeners to know your origin story and like how the hell you ended up dedicating your life to this super niche mycological wood phenomenon and how freaking cool it is and how much we owe you for this knowledge.
Okay, sure. So I have been a woodworker since, oh my goodness, I don't know, I was 10 or so. I grew up with working with my grandfather and doing a lot of window repair and that kind of stuff. And I didn't really like working with metals and glass. They cut up my skin too much. So in junior high, when woodworking was offered, I really fell in love with working with my hands with something that was a little bit less harsh on the skin. And so I was really into furniture making. I took all the woodshop classes in high school. There were quite a few at my high school. And my senior year, my teacher, Mr. Bloom, tried to get me into turning. And I was like, the lathe. I'm just like, it's really, I'd rather make furniture. So he suckered me into it. He brought in a piece of ambrosia maple, which is partial spalting, partial insect, partial tree. There's a whole bunch of things going on with that.
Whoa.
But it was blue and green and had holes in it. And then he brought in a piece of box elder, which is not spalting, but it is a bright pink sort of color in wood. And I just remember feeling like kind of betrayed. Like no one had told me that there was colored wood was an option. Felt like that had just been left out of the discourse. And I was like, if you had given me this at the start, I would have been on the lathe. Like I'm never leaving the lathe. This is all I want. Like, I just want to work with pink wood forever, basically, being like a 13-year-old. That was suddenly my life. And so I learned to turn because spalting here in the US right now, the interest is primarily with wood turners because it can be decayed. And so it's not the best for anything structural. Like you wouldn't want to be making a bed frame necessarily out of it. It's got some issues, but for decorative bowls and things, it's great. And so if you want to work with it, you kind of have to be in turning. And then I fell in love with turning, but I sort of vowed that day to never work with just plain wood again. I just had no interest in it. So I went to college and I majored in woodworking, which was in the art and design major. And I went to Northern Michigan University because they had a whole room just filled with lathes. And so I just turned all the time. I had a really good time, but I felt like I didn't really learn what I wanted to necessarily. It was very art focused, which is great. I learned a lot about form and function, but I didn't get a lot about wood itself, and I was very interested in it. And so I switched over to wood science for my master's and then PhD and postdoc and eventual job. But when I was trying to pick a thesis topic for my master's, my advisor asked, what are you into? And I was talking about, building and furniture and turning and stuff. And he saw some of my turned pieces and he said, well, what's going on here? And I was like, oh, that's spalting. And he was like, well, what's spalting? And I was like, this when the wood has color. I don't know.
Wow.
That's just what they call it. And he was like, well, what do we know about it? And so I started, digging. And then I was like, I don't actually think we know. And so if you can put into the framework, right now you can go on Wikipedia and there's a spalting entry, and you can Google it and you get basically the same answer over and over and over again. But back when I started doing this, there was you would get pictures of zone lines, so black lines, but there were a whole bunch. Is it bacteria? Is it box elder? Is spalting? Like there was just spalting is when wood is kind of colored. We're not quite sure what's going on. It's probably fungus, but probably also bacteria and maybe insects and maybe it's the tree and no one, it was just very nebulous. And so that became my master's project, which was just defining spalting, really digging into the literature, trying to come up with a way to bring it all together and starting to look at some of the fungi. And then it just sort of snowballed from there. My work got published, which we were really, master's thesis on spalting, I really didn't have high expectations for it, but people were interested. So I did a PhD. And then before I had finished my PhD, I got offered a postdoc doing the same thing. And then before my postdoc was done, I got offered a professorship to do basically the same thing. And then I wasn't even in that job for a year before I got offered another one to do the same thing. So it's a very niche area, but it reaches a lot of other branches of science because of the applications that are outside of wood turning and art. And so I think because of that, and it's interesting, and it does art and it does science and it does a whole bunch of things. I think it's very engaging for students in particular. So academia seems to be pretty on board with it. And I obsessed with it. So of course I just keep working with it.
Yeah. And I feel like as a scientific or science-driven person, working with wood, what a more perfect thing to focus on than spalting. And this is so cool to me because I feel like you became an inadvertent mycologist through your pursuit of understanding this.
It's so
And
true.
then-
I haven't taken, so you got to remember that I went into grad school with an art degree. So I didn't have any math classes other than I took a statistics class. I hadn't had chemistry. I hadn't had physics. Even in high school, I hadn't taken physics. And so certainly hadn't had any mycology classes. And actually, I still haven't had a single mycology class to this day, like a formal, I've read books, of course, but I haven't had a single formal mycology class. It was a lot of, all right, well, what is a fungus? I don't know. Let's read a book. Oh, no one actually, I guess the nice thing about not having the background is not knowing what you should know and what you shouldn't. So when a spalting fungus comes up and no one knows anything about it, it's not a downside because you don't know anything. And so, we come up with, all right, Chloroseborrhea, what do we know about it? It probably likes it a little cooler. Maybe it's green. When I'm working with these rare fungi, not knowing things doesn't bother me, but I think the same way it bothers other people.
Right. And it is truly a niche within a niche because mycology as a field is what I hear defined as a neglected mega science. And it totally is. And you are just like in your own crevice of delight. And the more I studied it, the more I read your book, I thought this would be so compelling to our listeners because you had a beautiful sentence in here about how you're not encouraging the mycelium, but you are encouraging pigment, and how the approach to do this from standard mushroom growing or fungus growing is opposite. So I thought, what a great lens for any fungal enthusiast just to like see what the fungi don't like, but to get all the metabolites out, but not the mycelium, not the hyphae, just all their enzymes and their juices. And I so want to get into the deep mycology, but perhaps before that, we should kind of pave the way for spalting in general. How do you define spalting?
Sure. The sort of professional definition of spalting is any color in wood, so not on wood, but in wood that is caused by a fungus. So it can't be a color by the tree. It can't be a color by bacteria. And it has to be deeper than say a half inch or so in, because there are lots of mold fungi out there that can secrete pigments, but they don't penetrate. And there's the types of pigments that spalting fungi have are sort of a unique class, and they're a lot more stable in UV. They don't move as well with water and that sort of thing. So they're very different than, say a green produced by a penicillium. So it's a very sort of niche grouping of fungi that have to have the ability to decay wood in order to then at least partially get inside the wood so that their pigments can be secreted.
Beautiful. And I'm sure people can think of the zone lines. That, to me, before I started looking into this, was spalted wood. And then I was like, oh, that blue stuff I find from Chlorocoborea is also technically spalting. And so is like white rot. So it's cool to know that very general definition of spalting. And could you talk a little bit about the myths and legends around spalted wood in the US? I know you mentioned some of that in your book, and since there's not really many people out there looking into this, I think it'd be worth debunking.
Sure. So are you in the Spalting 101 book or the Spalted Wood book?
Spalting 101.
Okay, so you have sort of a condensed version there, which is good. It's a little bit easier read. So there's two books out on spalting for people who care. Spalted Wood is sort of like this big, like coffee table type book that has a huge like European history on spalted wood. And then Spalting 101's the do-it-yourselfer's guide. But they both have little sections in there about urban legends and history. Spalting 101 a little bit more because I had done more traveling at that point. So I had been able to collect some basically fairy stories about spalted wood from Chile. In the US, we don't have cool fairy stories. Unfortunately, the United States is a little too new of a country for that, at least from our like Western perspective. But we still have myth around spalted wood, and that myth is about how to make wood spalt in the wild. And so everyone kind of has their own super secret recipe for making spalted wood. And they are amazing. You can't find them as often on the internet now because I've been giving these talks for, I don't even know, 20 years. And so a lot of that has fallen by the wayside. But in the first sort of 10 years of giving these talks, you could still go online and find recipes, like really, like some like really basic recipes, like cover it in dirt and leaves and wait a few years, which is fine because all wood decays, therefore all wood can spalt. So yes, if you leave a log on the ground, decay will occur. But some of them get really elaborate, like you're gonna put like fertilizer on it and mayonnaise. I saw one that was ground reindeer antlers. I have a lot of questions about that one. There's so many that involve beer, just like an incredible number that involve beer and either like pouring the beer on the wood or you drinking the beer and then urinating on the wood.
Wow.
Which is, it makes sense, right? Nitrogen is a limited resource. Your urine has nitrogen. If you drink the beer, I guess there's extra sugars. You can see the logic jumps. Like they're not that far.
Right.
And so it's really interesting. And there's definitely a cottage industry based around, buying some sort of like, how do you make your spalting mix? Oh, well, it's 1 part mayonnaise to 2 parts Miracle-Gro and Pabst Blue Ribbon. Oh, okay, I'm going to try that. So we have a lot of that. And I think it's really cool because it is a part of our history. None of it works, mind you. But that doesn't matter because spalting is so mysterious to people and they like it so much that they're willing to, engage in alchemy, basically, to try and get a natural decay process to happen.
That's so interesting. I feel like it says something about the culture too of just beer and mayonnaise. Like who cared about spalting wood for the last couple decades? And it's the same culture that was drinking beer and eating mayonnaise and
you can't get more American than beer and mayonnaise. You just can't.
No, you really, really can't. But okay, so when you were researching this, did you try these experiments and just not ever see them work and then put your foot down and thought, I'm gonna get behind the science of this?
Wow, I did not. And that was because I went and looked at the recipes and I looked at their timelines and all of them had at least a year out. And even in my master's, I was doing spalting in 8 to 10 weeks. So
wow.
Let's to be clear, I was never going to pee on wood to begin with. I have lines and that was a real hard line for me. I probably could have been convinced to pour beer on it, but I sort of felt like, well, if this is what the internet has to offer, if this is what our sort of cultural history has to offer, but I'm already doing it faster, I'll probably just carry on with what's working.
So is your only or most of your experience working with fungi like attempting to suppress the mycelial growth, but almost like stress it out to get it to produce spalting? Or what is your experience with working with fungi, growing with fungi, eliminating fungi, etc.?
I really only have experience with spalting fungi, and they're working on their growth and spalting. So trying to get the actual extracellular responses. So that doesn't necessarily mean inhibiting mycelial growth. Mycelial growth is functionally irrelevant because whether the fungi have colonized the wood or not doesn't really matter. They can carry a lot of pigment in their hyphae. And so if there's lots of hyphae in the wood and then you blend the wood or whatever, you can break the cell walls and get the pigment out. But a lot of these are very slow growing and will grow, so they'll grow really slowly and then secrete the pigment into the wood ahead of the mycelium. So yeah, we don't care so much about the mycelium load so much as getting the pigment to happen. And so a lot of the big problems in the lab, and even historically, if you look at, especially trying to grow a Chlorosiboria and get it to keep pigmenting, is that you have to continuously stress the fungi to give them a reason to keep using their resources to do this, because if you think about it in terms of humans, just to anthropomorphize fungi for a little bit, we're gonna, they're cute, it's fine.
Yeah.
Why would you use the resources to, why would you build a fence if there's no threat? Like, why would you use those resources to do that? And so fungi are the same. If they're growing in a really nice media plate, why would they secrete pigment if there's nothing to combat, no resource to hold. They have no competition. And so what we found in the lab was over the course of like even a month or two, the replating process, the fungi would stop producing pigment. And once they had down-regulated, it was really hard to get them to start producing again without basically making them battle. So, putting wood chips into the media or something that had a chemical signature from another fungus to get them to think, oh my God, I'm going to die. I better secrete pigment and hold my resource. And so that most of my research has been on, all right, how do we get these things to not grow faster, but keep them at this state of agitation? Right. So that they're not so stressed they die, but that they're constantly, we could think maybe high anxiety. We keep them in a state of high but functional anxiety.
Much like many of us, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's like humanity and COVID. That's what's happening.
Have you noticed that most pigments produced by fungi are correlated with some level of protection, and there's no just, benevolent pigment that they just produce because they're alive? I mean, what have you found about the colored metabolites and the ecological function?
There are lots of reasons that fungi secrete various colors. The most common, of course, is melanin. That's why people think about black lines when they think about zone lines and spalting. And so there are fungi that will, like Xylaria polymorpha is a really good example. That's dead man's finger. And so it will secrete melanin, very thick melanin mats, if the moisture content of the wood has gone too low, because it can help the wood retain moisture. There are some fungi that will secrete melanin in order to protect themselves from UV degradation. There are some fungi that will secrete melanin to detoxify their environment. So if there's copper in their environment, which is a common biocide used against fungi, they can, to a limited extent, sequester the copper within their melanin and then detoxify the region. And then there's some fungi, again, like dead man's finger, Xylaria polymorpha, that just become genetically distinct individuals so rapidly that it ends up making zone lines against itself.
Wow.
So I'm not sure that there are spalting fungi in particular. There are quite a number of mold fungi that just make pigment as part of the course. But in terms of spalting fungi, I'm not certain that there are some that just do it as a regular thing. Possibly some of the more aggressive white rots. So like Fomes fomentarius, fairly aggressive rot, does seem to secrete a minimal brown pigment. Actually, that's not true. There is one. Fistulina hepatica, which is poor man's beefsteak or beefsteak fungus.
Oh, yeah.
That one does. It secretes. That's what's responsible for English brown oak. And any brown oak, really. That's a very well-known one. And it secretes brown just because it's a brown rot. But it also seems to secrete a brown pigment. And so that's one of the reasons that English brown oak is so brittle, in case you have any woodworkers listening, because it's rotten. But yeah, that would be one that secretes as par for the course. And that coloring is very even. You should all Google English brown oak and then compare it to Elf's Cup on any wood and just look at the sheer volume of pigment you get out of poor man's beefsteak versus what you get out of Elf's Cup. So I'd say that's probably a big difference between one that just secretes for the joy of secreting versus Elf's Cup, which 9 times out of 10 will just stop if given any choice.
That's so interesting. So I have a quick question about the melanin aspect, and I don't know if you've looked into this, but do you know the mechanism of like the moisture retention, and how is the melanin doing that?
So wood loses moisture from its surface. And so the more melanin a fungus puts on the surface of the wood, the fewer places there are for the wood for the evaporation to occur.
Got it.
So if you have, trying to think of it in terms of lumber, but like in a twig on the forest floor, if dead man's finger gets on it and if there's bark on it too, so evaporation's only happening from the ends where the twig was broken off. And so all it has to do really is melanin coat those ends and it can retain the moisture in the piece.
Awesome. So we covered the basic types of spalting, which is the white rot, the zone line, and then the pigmenting, like the chlorocoboria. And I'm wondering how much this correlates with the 3 types of rotting. So there's the brown rot, white rot, and soft rot. Have you seen patterns, or like what have you kind of been able to put together about these?
So it kind of follows that, but not really. So there's only one brown rotting fungus that's used for spalting at this stage, because brown rot is so very destructive, and the damage that's left behind when the cellulose is removed but the lignin is left behind in the wood is that crumbly cubic rot that isn't really very good for anything. And so the only fungus that does it but doesn't destroy the wood is, again, Fistulina hepatica, poor man's beefsteak. So what I usually tell people is ignore the brown rots. That's just, don't play in that pool, because you're going to get disappointed really fast. White rots, of course, are white rots. So the bleaching you see in wood is white rot. And so that is a whole, right? That's white rot basidiomycetes. There are some ascomycetes that cause white rot. But for the most part, we're going to try and make this simple, right? Instead of being like, there's always something that breaks the rules. So we'll just go, we know things break the rules. We're making general classifications. Most of the bleaching effects that you see in spalted wood are done by white rotting basidiomycetes. Mm-hmm. And then most of the pigmentation is, so the greens, the purples, the whatevers, they're mostly ascomycetes, the soft rotting ascomycetes, which is like a little sub-genre of ascomycete. That they have to be able to actually break down the cell wall, at least partially. When I explain it to students, I always say the soft rots are just kind of slower rots. They're selective. They're little picky eaters. And then zone lines can really happen anytime. And so since zone lines are primarily a boundary line between 2 competing fungi, you see them a lot more with white rots. But there are plenty of ascomycetes that can form zone lines as well. And in fact, you can get colored zone lines when, say, a white rot meets a soft rotting spalting fungus. So like, say, the pinkish red lines that you can see in wood are often caused by some type of white rot coming into contact with Cytolydium cuboideum, which is flaming dragon fungus, and that is a soft rotting ascomycete. And so normally, left on its own, Cytolydium cuboideum would make this like pinky red stain all over everything. And the white rot would white rot, but get together, and oftentimes you just see a pink line where they've intersected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had no idea. Like back when I did the really brief spalting, I was like, oh my gosh, picked up your book, mind was blown. I forget everything I ever learned about spalting. And then, wow, I loved seeing the various colored zone lines. And is there any interesting mycology that you see between zone lining?
Right. So melanin generally is a high molecular weight pigment. And so it forms a sort of functional boundary that mycelium can't really get through. And so it's not alive, right? It's a dense secretion. And so there's nothing really, in theory, living in there. What can happen is that you can get zones of inhibition. So you might have 2 fungi meet and not put up a zone line, just avoid each other. So they just somehow agree that they're just not going to colonize this particular strip of the wood. And so you get a strip of inhibition. And so you can get then another fungus coming in and colonizing that strip, maybe after the other 2 have died or moved on. And so you can get things that maybe appear like something has been living in the zone line, but we don't have any evidence of that as of yet.
So spalting is caused by a pigment, right? Is the majority of that just a pigment that is excreted from the cell wall, or are there any instances where the cell wall itself or the hyphae itself is what's giving the color? So, should it not secrete any metabolites, you would still get this effect?
That's a really good question. So a lot of spalting. So first of all, the white rots aren't secreting. So they are decaying the lignin in the wood, which is a slightly pigmented area of the wood cell wall, and removing that sort of brownish color from the wood lightens the wood. So they're not technically secreting, they're decaying. Mm-hmm. The zone lines are secretions and the pigments are secretions. And then, wow, I lost my train of thought.
The pigments, the chlorocoboria.
Oh, right. So in terms of, a lot of the pigmenting fungi make the pigments in their cells, in their hyphae, and then those get secreted out. So you could harvest both from the mycelium and the wood if you really wanted to, and then break up the cell walls and get all the extra that's in there. Assuming that it had well colonized. It may not have well colonized yet, but there are some that don't secrete. And a big example of that are going to be the blue stains. And that is a huge, like a massive group of fungi, the ophiostomatoids, so the ophiostomas and the ceratocystises. And a lot of those are major pathogens. And so, think about sudden oak death and a lot of those things. You're looking at ceratocystis type fungi. And so those blue stains, a lot of them, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them don't necessarily secrete that color. And that color is a melanin. It's a different kind of melanin that makes zone lines. And it's actually like a blacky brown, but the way the light refracts off of it in the wood makes it appear blue. And that, for the most part, is actually still bound within the cell wall and isn't secreted.
That must explain why when I do see blue stained wood, it's very uniform and the whole wood is like kind of the same color blue. Whereas a lot of these other spalting situations, you obviously have patterns like with the zone lines, or like there's a patch of red, but it's not uniform throughout the whole wood.
Yes, and it also has to do with what stage colonizers they are. Blue stains are one of the first stages of colonization. And so lumberyards have this problem. If they don't treat their freshly milled logs, they blue in a day or two, because blue stain fungi are very adept at, they're in the air, landing on fresh cut lumber and immediately running radially and eating all the free sugars in the parenchyma cells. Whereas it's not that all fungi would really like to get the easy sugars in the parenchyma cells, but the Chloroseboria, the cytolydiums of the world, they just don't have that kind of distribution. And so they tend to be very late stage colonizers, and we tend to find them in the forest on wood that's already severely decayed. So the white rots have been through, the blue stains have been through, everything's been through, and the wood is already kind of mush. Mm-hmm. And then that seems to be when we start seeing a lot of the pigmenting fungi. So I think part of it is just when they're colonizing too. You can get a lot more colonization and a lot more even colonization if you're the first person there.
That's fascinating. It also makes me wonder why not all wood I see is spalted. Or maybe it is in some way, but
other fungi could have gotten there first.
Yeah.
Ones that don't make color. It could have, if it's lumber, if you cut it and dry it, then there's no fungal colonization. Mm-hmm. But in the woods, unless a tree has just fallen down, it's got fungi in it. It's just going to depend on which fungi got there first, and it's probably going to be a white rot or a brown rot. So it depends on your definition of spalting, right? If you're happy to count all white rot as spalting, then 75% of all hardwood forests are filled with spalted wood. It's just, are you being really picky and you just want zone lines, or are you okay with white rot as well?
Yes, I would be one of the picky people, like looking for the precious zone lines or rare pigments. So do you have a favorite type of spalting or a rare type that you just like are itching to tell people about?
I'm always going to be an Elf's Cup fan. I think I'll die an Elf's Cup fan.
Yeah.
It's such a pretty color, that sort of aquamarine, blue-green pigment. And it's not at all rare, but because people aren't used to looking for it, they treat it as rare quite a bit. But it's all over, and it's got a worldwide distribution. And so it's very easy to find once you start looking for it. But I love that it's this thing that's hidden that's not hidden. And it also, all of the information we have about how spalting became really popular, at least in the European sense, because we have more information on that right now than a lot of the other countries, is that Elf's Cup is really what started the big movement into spalting. And so that's in the Spalted Wood book, and that traces the history from the late 1400s to now of how spalted wood moved through Europe and how it became a treasured commodity of kings and queens and churches. It was worth its weight in gold. We found old bills of sale and just how highly prized it was. And so I love it that it really launched our Western fascination with spalting.
Yeah, no kidding. And I've seen old wood blocks that were picked because I assume they had this blue spalting. Like, this is great. I'm going to use it in my artwork. And even today, the pigment remains. So it seems like a very stable coloring, and just what an awesome fungus to kind of unite us all too, if it's that prolific, and you see it on most continents. I mean, I find it all the time when I'm out and about, and it's a delight. I don't see the mushrooms very often, but I do see the wood, and it's always just so satisfying.
It often brings a smile to people's faces to see that. It's just such a bright color in and amongst the, like, you know, the down leaves and needles. And then you're like, there's just this little aquamarine piece of wood. It's gorgeous.
Right. And blue is a rare color in nature. So it's super awesome to see that. And I really want to get into your work with these pigments, because in your book, you have protocols for how to extract them, and you can actually extract the pigments and continue to paint the woods, which I thought was so cool. Could you talk about like how you discovered that you could do this, and then any kind of interesting research surrounding this pigment extraction project?
Sure. So it's important to keep in mind that people have been extracting pigments, especially from Chlorosiboria, since the late 1700s, because the color was so nice. But they didn't really do a lot with it, and that's because it, like most of these spalting pigments, they're, as you noted, they're very UV resistant. They're very sticky, right? So they don't move with water. And so that means that in order to extract them, you have to use fairly harsh solvents like paint stripper, dichloromethane, acetone to some degree, chloroform, those sorts of things. And so that makes them not as friendly to work with. So a lot of the research really kind of died on the vine. Oh, look, we pulled this color out of fungi. Now what are we going to do with it? I don't know. The fungus is hard to grow. Move on. There's other things. We can get it out of plants and it'll be fine. And so the extraction wasn't like the big deal. Although the first time I extracted it out, I was so excited because I had this like vial of blue and it was just the most beautiful color in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But after extracting and looking at that, what really took off was, okay, so we've taken the guesswork out of spalting in terms of time, not out of how it's going to go, because it'll go where it wants to go regardless. So what do we do with it? And spalting up to that point, even in the lab with growing the fungi, it was still going to take about 3 months to get any decent zone lines. And so then all of a sudden we were like, well, we have the pigment here in a jar and a pipette. I can spalt this wood in an hour. This is a huge change.
Wow.
But it's not, and this is hard, I think, sometimes for people to wrap their heads around, is that it's not different than quote unquote natural spalting, right? Because if it's just a secretion, then it doesn't matter if you wait months to years for the fungus to do it in the wood, or you wait that same amount of time in the lab and then just collect it and then put it on the wood. Like either way, it's the same process, except you're not getting the associated decay then. And so that was really big, and it opened up a lot of, all right, so now we can use spalted wood for structural things, because we can pick wood you could pick a piece of furniture that's already put together as long as it doesn't have a finish on it. Mm-hmm. And I want a blue-green tabletop. Okay, here's a vial of the blue-green pigment extracted, just dump it on and it'll stain and it'll be there forever. And that was awesome. And then also from that, we started thinking, all right, so these are really good pigments. They're UV stable. They don't move with water. What else can we color? And I just sort of went through a year or two where I just was dumping fungal like puke on everything. Trying to will it dye stone? Yes. Will it dye Teflon? Yes. Will it dye glass? Yeah. It sticks to everything. I did a whole bunch of work with textiles. It's really, actually, the best thing is polyester, which is notoriously difficult to dye. And it takes to that just so well. It doesn't wash off, even bleach doesn't really affect a lot of these pigments. And so we're just like, oh my gosh, this is great. And so that really opened up what else can we, now that we can extract these, and we know how to reliably grow them, because that was a big hurdle. Like, how do we keep them producing pigment? What can we do with them? What are their properties? And that's one of the reasons that I'm a professor in the sciences, even though technically I'm a sculptor and I, turn spalted wood and I make big sculptures, which is, really what my heart is at. But I'm a professor in the sciences because people are really interested in these pigments for other things. Like, we got a National Science Foundation grant to work on using Chlorosiboria xylindin. And I think you had emailed me about this. That's our grant. the National Science Foundation grant to use xylindin to make solar cells and photovoltaic cells.
Oh, so it's at Oregon State, which is where you are, which makes perfect sense. Okay, cool.
That's a grant that I was on that grant. And so making various photovoltaic cells with xylindin, because it's a thin film, a thin porous film, and you can drop cast it, and it's got great conductive properties. And so that was really successful. We've dyed textiles. We've successfully converted the pigments into an ink that can be put in inkjet printers. So most textile printing now is done on inkjet printers, right, instead of dye baths and things. And so you can put, particularly the red, which is Dramata, the name of the pigment is Dramata, and it's from Cytoladium cuboideum, which is flaming dragon fungus. And you can put that in an inkjet printer and, print a t-shirt or whatever you want, print a logo on a t-shirt. We've used them as they can be carried in natural oils pretty well. And so you can use them for just decking protection because they're UV retardant. And so putting them in, say, a linseed oil for your deck helps prevent graying. You can put them in paints as a colorant. There's so many options now. And that's one of the things we do is just to be clear, I don't have a background in any of this. Obviously, we've discussed I came from an art degree. I don't know how to make solar cells. I don't know how to make inkjet printers, but I do know how to grow these fungi. And that's what many people have struggled with, is keeping them producing. I can keep them alive and I can keep them producing, and I can supply. And so I end up helping out with a lot of these cool ideas because I'm the fungus wrangler.
Yeah, you're the farmer.
Who has these, and no one else can really seem to keep them alive reliably. So then I end up working on all these cool projects with people who are like, oh, we're going to do this. Can you give us, a couple gallons of pigment? I'm like, yeah, give me a week and I'll have it to you. And then, we get to try something new.
So are you growing these like in a liquid culture form or like a tiny bioreactor? I don't know if you can or want to tell us, but if you can.
We grow them in a lot of different ways. And which one produces more pigment depends on the fungus. So some we have in like little bioreactors with agitation. Some of them grow better in static liquid culture. Some of them grow better on wood chip plates. It just depends on the fungus. They all have kind of their own preferences. But yeah, we can grow them in very large quantities. I mean, large for us in a lab. I don't know about industrial scale. But we don't have a lot of problems with it, which is really great. Now that we've figured out, what they like and don't like, and finding that balance between, all right, it really likes this media, so let's not use this media. It tolerates this media, let's use this one instead, because again, state of agitation is key.
Right. This is so fascinating, and thank you for doing a lot of this work. I mean, xylindin seems like it could be a miracle pigment. It's extremely versatile. Do you know if it's edible or safe to consume?
In fact, yes. So we've done a preliminary, at least. We've done 2 rounds of toxicological studies, and they've given us the same data, which is we did, I believe we did zebrafish embryos, and then there may have been a secondary organism. I'm having a hard time remembering. But so we've done the testing now twice, and the results have been the same in that we can't even create an LD50 for xylindin. It's just not, it just doesn't do anything. And I think part of that is because it binds so much. So it's very, very hard to get enough of it to exist in a state that isn't bound to whatever it's on. So in order to do like zebrafish testing, you have these well plates. And you put the compound in the well, and then you grow the zebrafish embryo in the well, and you see how it reacts. So if you drop xylindin into a well, it's in dichloromethane, because that's how you have to move it. The dichloromethane evaporates, and now the well plate is green. But the zebrafish are incubated in water, and xylindin is only very minutely soluble in water. So how much is actually the zebrafish in contact with? It's so hard to do. And in order to get enough that it's actually a chunk, it's a incredible amount. And so there's just, it has such low toxicity, we just functionally say it's fine. The red one, Dramata from Cytoladium cuboideum, we could make LD50s for, but they were, and I'm trying to remember, they were somewhere around like the LD50 for like table salt, right? In terms of, in theory, this could kill you, but I don't know how you'd get enough of it to do that.
Got it. Wow. I mean, Do you feel like industry is going to notice Xylendon one day, put it in a giant bioreactor, and everybody's blue shirts and blue cereals and everything will like be Xylendon? It just seems so sustainable.
It's not that industry hasn't noticed. We've talked to a lot of people like Sherwin-Williams and places like that, and they routinely, they're interested, but they're not willing to switch over their factories because especially textiles have been moving to water-based dyeing, and even paint companies and stuff, right? They want to move to everything water-based. They're trying to move away from solvents. Right. And this is great for the environment in theory, but in practicality, water-less systems would be a lot better because then you don't have rinse water effluent and that sort of thing. Dichloromethane can be very well recaptured. It almost flash evaporates. And so if you build they're called rotovaps, where you can, apply it and then just put just a tiny amount of heat and then it flash evaporates the dichloromethane and then it condenses back out. And so you collect it back on the other end. There's infrastructure that would need to be put in place. But if they were willing to do that, they could basically get away from water and not really have any type of waste. But they don't. There's such a problem with public perception and chemicals that I think they fear the public outcry. Oh my gosh, you're using this. My shirt was made with paint stripper, instead of understanding that there's no paint stripper in the shirt. It was used as a solvent and now it's gone. Yeah. And all that's left is the pigment. But that has been the hurdle routinely. We have not been able to commercialize anything because they always get to we want to carry it in water. And me saying, if it carried in water, it wouldn't have these properties. The reason you don't have to use a mordant on textiles like you have to with lichen dyes and other fungal dyes is because it doesn't carry in water. It doesn't degrade. Yeah. But if you want all those properties, you have to pay for them. Like there's no magical pigment out there that it carries in water when you want it to and doesn't when you don't.
Right. Wow, Xylendon. I'm just in awe right now, and I can't wait to start trying to grow it again. I have this experience. I saw an elf cup fungus and was super excited about it. I saw the mushroom, and I put it on a Petri plate, and I saw little gloops of blue, blackish metabolite. But I've never seen that again. I keep trying to grow it when I find it and then encourage the metabolites. But yeah, is there anything else you can say about exploring spalting fungi?
Yeah, a lot of them produce multiple colors based upon potentially other pigments involved, potentially concentration. It really just depends on the fungus. And so I do a lot of research in the Peruvian Amazon rainforest because I was looking for new colors. And so we sampled a lot of these new colors, purples and things that we hadn't seen here in the US, and got the permits and brought them back, did the sequencing. And what we found is a lot of these fungi were the same fungi we had here. And if not the exact same species, at least within the genus. And so what we learned from that was conditions and expression matter more than species. And so really right now with controlled spalting, we only really use 4 species, 2 of which are in the Chlorosoboria genus. And so we can get the full range, the full rainbow out of just these 4. Wow. Based upon basically how long we incubate them. So Chlorosoboria, is a blue-green. So it starts off more green and gets bluer sort of the longer it grows. Cytoladium cuboideum, which makes the Dramata pigment the red, it starts off orange, it goes red, then it produces a blue, and then that blue and red kind of mix and you get a purple. And then there's Cytoladium ganodermopterum, which is the golden mango fungus. And it starts off with a yellow, and then it makes sort of this olive green, and then it makes a brown, a very unattractive brown, so we tend not to show pictures of that one. And then it makes a purple, and then it makes a red, just on the length of time that it's been growing. And so, yeah, they're really complex, their pigments and their metabolites, and which is why I'm going to be doing this functionally until I die.
Yeah. And I hope many more people do, because it seems like such a wonderful thing to start implementing in our consumer heavy society. And I'm looking at the pictures in your book right now, the scanning electron of like the pigment deposits, and
oh yeah,
the variety is really cool. You've got the Chlorocoboria that looks like a sponge, and then the spiky, sharp-looking one. Does the shape of these pigments tell you anything about its properties?
That's a physics question, so I don't know how well I can answer that. Anything that makes a naturally occurring crystal of that length, which you're looking at in the Dramata pigment, because it makes very large crystals in terms of like the normal length for an organic crystal. And so those naphthoquinonic crystals like that, that kind of shape tells us that maybe lasers might be a good application for them, something like that. And anything that forms a film, like xylindin or like the pigment, we don't know what the pigment is from the golden mango fungus. Anything that forms a film like that can be looked at for like conductivity types of stuff. But other than that, I mean, again, I think that's more of a physics question outside my area.
No, that's fair. It's interesting to see the morphological characteristics and how they differ. So I know we are running tight on time, but I really, really wanted to ask you a bit about, since you know so much about wood anatomy, do you have anything to say about how fungi move through wood? Would be so interesting. And I know it's probably case by case, species by species, wood by wood or whatever, but any like general thing you can share with us, we'd love.
That is a really big question. And there are whole classes in university dedicated just to this question. So just really quickly, there are a lot of the airborne molds and then also the like really ophiostomatoid type fungi that land on wood and utilize the free sugars in the ray cells, which are the tree's lunchbox, more or less. And so they don't do a whole lot of decay, if any. It depends on the fungus. Mostly they access different cells through the pits and move through there. And then when they run out of free sugar, they move on. And then you get into the decay fungi. So the brown rots, the white rots, and the soft rots. And the brown rots, so there's three building blocks of wood. There's lignin, cellulose, and hemicellulose. And hemicellulose and cellulose are functionally just sugar polymers. And lignin is this sort of rigid backbone type structure. So lignin is what gives wood sort of its woodiness. And then cellulose and hemicellulose are sort of the tissue in like the most basic sense. And so brown rots, they can go through and they can degrade the cellulose and to some degree the hemicellulose, and then they leave behind the lignin shell, which is why brown rot is crumbly. It has that cubic crumbly cracking. And so it's like just the bones without the tissue. White rots can degrade all the cell wall components, but tend to take out the lignin. And so without the structure, you get a lot of tissue and other stuff left behind, which is why white rots are soft and spongy and very flaky because the bones of the wood have been removed. And then soft rots, there are a couple of different types, but they're very selective in which parts of the cell wall they go after, which is why soft rotting fungi aren't as destructive because they're not wholesale digesting. They're sort of going into certain places in the wood, in the cell wall.
Picky eaters.
Yes.
So in your studies, have you seen anything that's telling about the actual architecture of the wood being instrumental to the fungus? Like I'm thinking about, here's a given fungus in its natural log versus chopping it up into a sawdust or wood chips. And if one environment over the other might help let it grow or thrive better than fruit mushrooms. And one thing I'm thinking about is like, shiitake, it grows great on logs. You can just do the method where you drill a hole, put some plug spawn in there, and then in a few years you'll get shiitake mushrooms. And some fungi do really, really great on logs like that and not at all if you were to chop it up and put that same log into like a bag full of wood chips. And the only real difference there is like, yeah, a lot of times those wood chips are older, they've lost their moisture, they might have been pre-digested, or they don't have the microbial ecology that might actually be good for the fungus, but it just doesn't do the work. It doesn't work as well. And do you think any of that has to do with the actual architecture?
So that's another really complicated question. So growing mushrooms is, of course, very different than growing spalting.
Right.
And so when people ask about, what size wood spalts the best, because, there are woodworkers who want to use it to make tables or whatever. There are wood turners who want to use it. It's not necessarily intuitive. So spalting a large log, can take about the same amount of time as spalting a tiny piece, whereas pieces in the middle size tend to spalt the fastest. And if you think about it, those big logs, the fungi have to really interact and be stressed in order to do a lot of spalting. And so if there's all this resource, they're going to avoid each other first and use all the free sugars they can get before they start interacting. So there's time there in which you have to get the fungi to, to actually sense each other and start doing things. In very small pieces, the fungi may determine it's not worth their time and may choose to just not engage and sporulate and move on instead of staying there and be like, all right, it's a tiny piece of wood. There's 3 of us. I just don't care enough.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in those medium-sized pieces of wood, they're forced to interact, but there's enough food to make it worth their while. And that, at least in terms of from what we understand, seems to be, sort of the ideal situation. And so for woodworkers, we say pre-cut turning blades. Don't turn the bowl, but cut the circle. And those tend to spalt very quickly. And of course, it's wood species specific too. The more naturally decay resistant the wood species is, the longer it's going to take to spalt and all of that.
Very cool. Are there any spaltings that you find really difficult to recreate in your lab?
We have a harder time with the colored zone lines, mostly because, and this is, again, anthropomorphizing, but the fungi just have to be in the right mood. Because if you don't get them in the right mood, especially the white rot may just completely take over the piece and just kill the pigment. Or the white rot may not be in the mood, and then the piece completely pigments, and then the white rot can't grow over the pigment very well. So they have to, be, you put them on, and you can know their growth rate, and you can know the conditions, and you could just be like, all right, so I put in 30, and 5 of them made pink zone lines, and 5 of them just refused to grow entirely, and 5 of them sporulated. And so I'd say colored zone lines are kind of always a gamble.
And how do you inoculate wood panels? Do you just throw some liquid culture on it, or do you drill a hole and maybe pipette some in there?
Liquid cultures have notoriously not worked well. You can grow pigment in them for extraction really well, but the sort of ratio of food to fungus is really off. So if you think about why don't recipes work? And one of the reasons is you're giving the fungus extra easy food. So most fungi aren't going to start digesting wood, which is very difficult, if there's just free sugar laying around. Right. And so in liquid cultures, there's just a bunch of free sugar. And so if you take that and you pour it over the wood, you just put a sugar solution on your wood. And so you've just added all this time, because fungi aren't dumb. They're going to eat the sugar before they have to start secreting the enzymes to break down these polymers to get more sugar. And so the best thing is if you grow them on Petri plates on 2% malt agar. That's really idealized for spalting, because you can take those, agar is fairly firm. And so you can take that agar circle out of the Petri plate and just put it on the wood. And it's perfect. There's just enough food to get them situated, but not enough to keep them on the agar. So they move into the wood fairly quickly. And so, one of those plates about every 6 inches to a foot does really well. But a lot of people fail at spalting because they want to cut corners. You have to follow directions. Spalting is all about following directions for DIY spalting. And so, you can't take the Petri plate and mash it up and mix it with water and spray it on the wood, because you've just diluted the food source and you've diluted the inoculum load. And there's just not enough there for the most part. Don't grow it in a 2-liter bottle of sugar water, because the fungus, for the most part, unless you've got an agitator and you have a fungus that will grow under those conditions, for the most part, you just have a whole bunch of sugar water and then a little layer of fungus. And then you dump it on the wood. And again, the fungus has to eat all that sugar. It doesn't have to, but it's going to, before it gets into the wood. So you have to really not cut corners if you really want it to work on a faster timeline.
This is just such interesting and I think instrumental information for cultivators out there, because I work in a bio lab during the day, and one thing we talk about is how there's not a lot of defined media for fungi. There are for many other microorganisms. So we experiment. We give it a ton of Peptone, or not at all, any, and thinking about how I've always known there's such thing as too much food, but really putting a narrative onto it and thinking like the fungus. And if you were the fungus and this is all the food you've been given, where would you go and what would you do? You take the easy stuff.
Yeah, fungi are lazy, just like people. And I think it's really
Yeah.
important for people to remember that. Like, they're really highly evolved, right? If you consider where they're at in the tree of life. So, if you're starving in the desert and your options are like a free hamburger at McDonald's or to kill a cow, like you're gonna take the free hamburger, and fungi are just like us.
I love this. Sari, thank you so much for doing all the research that you've done and then writing books about it. And I have really been geeking out with this Spalting 101, and I can't wait to just experiment myself. And I'm so excited about the pigments and everything you're doing. I will have all your books and your documentary and anything else you would like to share in the show notes for other people to check out. And yeah, I super
Also,
appreciate your time.
thank you so much. And just real quick, for anyone who wants to get their hands on the pigments or the spalting fungi, or just wants to support the research, because we're primarily, my lab is crowdsourced for the most part. We try not to spend too much time writing grants that really restrict us. So all our money comes from the community. And so if you want to be a part of that, we have a Patreon. It's just patreon.com/spalting. And so we would love your support. And it's how you can get the fungi and the pigments too. We will just ship you pigment if you want pigment in a jar. Bring it on.
Amazing. I'm going to sign up for sure. I think there's a whole world that we can learn from spalted wood and spalting mycology. Thank you, Sari.
Thank you.
Big thanks to Sari Robinson and all the new science they have brought to the field of mycology. Big thanks to our listeners for making this possible. Please spread the word by leaving a review or telling your friends and family. It goes a long way. We feature one a week, so if you want to be featured on the podcast, that's the way to do it. We love you so much. Big hug to everyone out there in the world. And as always, much love, and may the spores be with you.